Welcome back to the Root to Rise Seeds for Spiritual Awakening podcast. I'm your host, Meg Kearney, and today my guest is Carrie Rowan. Carrie is an international best-selling author of the book Tell a New Story. She's also a mindset and energy coach, a singer-songwriter, and a speaker. She pretty much does it all. So in the episode today, we talk about those mental stories that we have about ourselves that are running in the background, or maybe even in the forefront of our mind, and Carrie gives tangible, actionable steps of how to rewrite these stories so we can create the lives we want. Thank you so much for tuning in. There's so much wisdom in this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Carrie. So excited to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Megan.
Yeah, of course. So you wrote a book. It's called Tell a New Story, 5 Simple Steps to Release Your Negative Stories and Bring Joy to Your Life. And I'd love to talk with you about it today. And in the book, you have this framework called the story method. So what is the story method?
Ooh, that's a good question. The story method is something I created because I love for people to really have something easy, like especially if I'm doing a talk with a group of people, I want them to have like a takeaway. And the story method came to me one time when I was out on a walk because it really encapsulates everything. And it's the acronym for STORY, STORY. And it encapsulates everything and my 5 steps. And if you can remember that, it will really help you dig in. Do you want to go through what the 5 of them are?
Yeah, let's do it.
So the S is your state, like not where you live, but your state of mind, which you do actually live in, right? So it's your state of mind, like where do you find yourself mostly? Because we usually have some emotions that we're all kind of addicted to, like that we usually hang out in. So if you ask yourself, hey, what is my state? Like where am I? Where do I usually hang out? And more importantly, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be? Where, do I want to live in joy and fulfillment? Do I like the state that I live in? So state is really, there's so much in that. But when it comes to your stories, you want to figure out what state of mind you're in, because what state of mind you're in determines what stories you'll tell and pick out. And it kind of goes like, if you're in a good state of mind, guess what stories you're telling? And if you're feeling kind of down and negative, well, guess what stories you pull out on that day, right?
Totally, yes. And our stories can run wild if we let them. You talk about some reasons that we might tell these stories. What are some reasons that people may tell stories? I know you mentioned a few in the book.
Absolutely. Well, because we're talking about state, I'm going to say they tell the stories because of the state of mind they're in, right? So if they're super frustrated and life isn't going where they want, you're sort of, I like to think about that scale of emotion, right? Like that emotional guidance scale. If you're way down in those frustration and disappointment, well, you're pulling out all those stories of frustration and disappointment, aren't you? You're like, oh, and another thing. And here's the thing, the momentum starts to pick up and then you start to remember other stories. And your brain, it's just doing its job. It's going to go get all those stories. It's going to remember everything that person did wrong. Do you ever like in that state of mind and like you might be in an argument or thinking about somebody, you're like, oh my God, all of a sudden all the things they ever did wrong come so easily to you because you're focused on what's not right, on what's wrong. And the brain is just going to do its job and find that for you. So that's why state's important, because that's why you're telling those stories, because you're in that mood. And here's the interesting thing. You can tell the same story when you're in a good mood or when you're in a bad mood. And guess what? It's flavored by that state that you're in. You've ever noticed that? Or you know somebody whose stories you know well, you can pick up on easily, right, when they're doing that. So that's why it's really important to understand what state you're in. State is the foundation of everything, right? It's like 85% of everything we do is that state of mind that we approach it in.
Mm-hmm. I definitely could see that. And I have done that myself where I'm in a good mood telling a certain story, then something happens, I'm in a bad mood, I tell the story to somebody else and it has a completely different element to it. And in thinking about our state, would you say that our state, maybe our physical bodily state, is what determines our stories? Or is it the stories that are influencing our bodily state?
I love talking about this. Here's the interesting thing. It goes both ways, right? Based on our state, the state that we're in affect the stories that we tell. But just like you said before, the stories we tell can affect the state. So you can be in a really great mood, right? And you're feeling good and you're cruising through your day. You're feeling like you're kind of in that flow, right? And then all of a sudden, bring, that friend calls and she wants to hear the story of what happened 2 days ago, but you're already way past that. You really don't want to talk about that story because it was angry and frustrating and wow, the person was such a jerk. So you don't want to talk about that, right? But they just kind of cajole you and, oh, come on. And then you feel guilty and you need to tell them. So you start telling the story. It happens to your state. It goes right down the tubes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way, so your story can also affect your state. Your state can affect your story, but your story can affect your state. Isn't that kind of cool?
That's really cool. And yeah, definitely, I've had those moments where I have a second thought of, well, maybe I shouldn't tell this story right now. Like you said, it just seems so far in the past, but you want to connect with people. You want to tell them the story. They want you to tell them the story. And then boom, right down the tube. So
It's
you
so true.
talk about the importance of managing our state. What are some techniques that you personally use to manage yours?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, we just did one before we got on the call. I love to use little physical energy medicine things. Like I'm really big into tapping. So if something's frustrating or, whatever, I've got something on my mind that's really bothering me or causing me anxiety. I'll even be out walking sometimes and I'll just start tapping, what a EFT is, emotional freedom. So I start tapping and I have a video actually in my book. Um, so energy medicine is a really easy, fast way to do it. But because what we're doing is we're changing our body, right? Using your physiology to change your state happens really fast, right? Like if something's happening and you're like, wait, I'm just going to step away from my desk and I'm going to go for a walk, right? Maybe it's lunchtime and you're at the office. And when you leave and you physically go for the walk, you're changing everything. Think about it in your physiology. You're moving, you're breathing differently. Your arms are swinging. You're actually balancing your energy centers when you walk like that. Maybe you're picking up your pace. Your heart is starting to pick up. So everything chemically is changing in your body. So it's only natural that, boom, your state changes right along with it. That's why exercise is one of the things that works so quickly. And then couple that with music. So now we're changing what we're focused on because now we're focused on the song. Now you're walking and you have good music. Well, now you've got two things. You're using your focus and your physiology to change your state. And that's really the fastest way to do it. It's why I usually keep my little mini tramp here in my office behind me because I'll jump on my little mini trampoline before I get on a big call.
That's so fun. I need one of those. You really do.
It's awesome. It's awesome. A little 10-minute workout on that is like a 40-minute run, they say.
Wow, that sounds great. So the second step of the process is true intention. And I
Yes.
want you to talk a little bit about this as well. But kind of going back to what you were saying about movement and even music, sometimes if I'm in maybe a lower vibe state, I have a tendency to put on music that's maybe also lower vibe. Or maybe I'm frustrated and I'm going to a yoga class. Usually by the end, my frustration is gone, but sometimes the stories are still going in that movement, or I'm latching on to stories of a song that's more lower vibe. So can you talk about how intention plays into what we use to change our state?
Sure, absolutely. Well, intention's so important because it's one of the things we don't think about with our story, right? Like we never think about, ooh, why am I telling that story, right? It's sort of like you said earlier, you start to catch yourself. You're recognizing what you're doing with your stories. Ooh, I was just telling that, but really that could be a good story, but I was just telling it so negatively, right? So it's starting to become aware because we use our stories. And I tell people a lot of times when you start to get into this work, you have to have some self-compassion, right? Because you're going to uncover things and reasons that are kind of yucky that you might not like. So there can be really positive intentions. Oh, I'm telling the story because I want to really connect. Or like you said earlier, oh, I was going to tell my friend the story because I want to connect with her. But sometimes it's not in our best interest, right? Because it's going to bring us down. So when we can start to recognize that, and really look at what is the intention behind that story, because a lot of times stories can be sneaky. There's these sneaky little intentions of trying to get needs met through a story, right? And you're too scared or whatever the other emotion is. So you use a story to try to maybe influence somebody or get somebody to like you or get somebody to not like somebody else. Or these are all the kind of the dark side of stories I talk about in my chapter. Or maybe You want to elicit help from somebody. So you tell the story, the victim story, that nobody is ever there for me, right? Because you're trying to get something met in sort of not a direct way, right? So we use stories a lot of times. And sometimes we don't even really realize that we're doing that. But the other person feels some incongruence there, in our story. So I love to do an exercise when I'm doing like a big talk in a group of people, I'll present the idea of intention and I'll have them tell a story with a real deliberate intention. Then they have to tell the same story with a different intention. And the room just goes nuts because it's so crazy that you can be talking about the same thing and the whole story changes, right?
I loved that part in your book. It was like a light bulb moment of just, okay, sometimes we're telling these stories, we're on autopilot, but we actually do have the ability to stop and see and think, what is the objective of me telling this story? And like you said, sometimes it's needs that we're trying to meet or connection that maybe we could get in some other way. And I would love to, if you could share a little bit more on this. In your book, you talk about little black cloud stories, and you specifically talked about stories you were telling around sleep deprivation and motherhood, and I just loved it. So would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
The little black cloud stories. Oh my gosh, we can all picture somebody, like I'm picturing somebody right now, I'm not going to say any names, that always has those little black cloud stories. How's your day? How do you think it is? Or how you doing? Just getting by. It's all you can really do. You know what I mean? Like those kind of things. They always have that doom. It's like Eeyore, right? Like
Yeah.
the little Eeyore stories. And it's just sort of habit, right? Like a lot of these people, a lot of us, all of us, I'm totally guilty of it too. It's just becomes this habit for us, right? Or we never really do anything proactively, and we can talk about that. But the sleep deprivation stories are hilarious because I think about it now because my kids are older. But when my kids were really small and they were 16 months apart, it was like sleep was a real luxury in our house. And I kept telling that one little story. I kept telling myself, this one wouldn't sleep or that one wouldn't sleep. Or I'd try to, everybody said, drive them in the car, they'll go to sleep. Well, my kids never did. They cried in the car. I'm like, what am I doing wrong? Right? So all these stories of what am I doing wrong? Why am I doing this right? Like whatever it is you're doing or you're frustrated about, all those little stories kick in, right? Because that's really our brain trying to somehow in its own little way keep us safe, right? So starting to recognize those stories, whatever they are, and just peeling back the layers. It took me a while to realize I had this tiny little story hidden inside that, I would finally come downstairs. My youngest daughter had this 1 hour long bedtime routine. And so that's a long time of bedtime. You had the stories and then you had this and then the music, right? So anyways, there's a really cool ending to that music story, but with her, it took me a while to realize. I just came downstairs. I was just so like sleep deprived, tired. There's nobody else to help me. All those little stories that weren't true. And I heard myself say, why does it have to be so hard? And that little story shook me because I was like, wow, I say that to myself a lot. And then I started catching myself, right? And that's really this metacognition that happens when you start to realize what your stories are and what the flavors, because it's hard to catch the ones when we're in fight or flight, when we're in total stress, because we're stressed and we're not thinking in our forebrain, right? We're back here. We're living in that stress mode. So those are the hardest stories to get. So that one day when I had my head in my hands and I was crying and it was just so much, I heard it. I heard it for some reason. I was just vulnerable enough and aware enough to hear that. And that was like huge for me because I could hold on to it and be like, wait a minute, why am I saying that? Do I want that? Do I want it to be hard? Because I'm really just getting more of that. All I'm saying really to the universe, if you want to peel back, the law of attraction quickly, is I'm yelling that I want more of that. Right? Because it's really the way it works. It doesn't really hear what you're saying. It just hears, I'm amplifying it. So I'm actually saying, hey, give me more of that, which is really what I didn't want. So when I started to peel that back and started to kind of change my mindset to look at all these amazing things that were happening and stop focusing on that one little thing and that story that was making me feel worse.
I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. I had the smallest glimpse of sleep deprivation when I got my puppy. And I thought that was hard. So I can't imagine two kids 16 months apart. So kind of going off of that, how from the time when you knew that you were telling a story to getting to the point where maybe you could appreciate the experience a little bit more, what steps were you taking and how did your experience shift and maybe even your relationship with your husband shift? Because I know obviously he was hearing your story as well and he was experiencing his own probably stories too. So
Yeah.
how did things shift for you?
Well, I started once I think the whole the biggest part of the stories is figuring out what they are, right? Because you have different stories than I have and so on and so forth, even though a lot of our stories are collective. And so really just undercover that undercover work that you start to do, then I started noticing, wait a second, I'm saying this story. Ooh. And then you start to catch yourself and you're like kind of pulling yourself back like, ooh, I don't like that story. Ooh, that story makes me feel bad, which is the next step, right? So you know what your intention is, why you're telling it, but what's the outcome? That's the O, STORY. What is the outcome of the story? Well, okay, I keep telling that story about why it's so hard and it seems to be getting harder. That's so interesting the way that works, right? So the outcome is I'm getting just what I keep talking about, right? Because
Mm.
that is the ultimate law of attraction. You get what you focus on, whether you want it or not. And I think that little caveat at the end is what most people don't know. Well, I'm going to get what I focus on. I want this. I said I wanted that. I want this. But really, what are you putting out there? So when I could correlated those two things together and realize like, whoa, I don't like the way I feel after I say that. And then you can start to ask yourself, how does that story make me feel? Oh, is that really supportive and loving to me? No, no, and no. Oh, and by the way, how is that making everybody else feel around me? What if I open that story up now to, like you said, my husband? Now, what's he going to start thinking? How hard it is, how hard this is. It's just a victim story that I'm passing out to everybody that I tell it to. So now everybody's joining me in that same negative emotion. Wow, that is really hard. It's okay to validate, but like joining it is a different story, right? When everybody else is taking that same story, now it's becoming our collective story. Like, wait a second, time out. Do I want that story? Do I want it to be hard? No, I want it to be easy and joyful because this is a beautiful time in our life. We've got these beautiful young children who are healthy and happy. And, how can I shift my perspective to that?
Mm.
And looking at the outcome, beginning with the end in mind, is really a powerful thing to do. If you can stop long enough to really be aware of what that story is that's making you feel bad.
Yeah, you talk about the outcome and how that's kind of where we start when we're thinking about where we want to go. And I'm curious, what does beginning with the outcome look like in daily practice or maybe with your stories? How could we really put this into play in our daily lives?
Well, that's a good question. Well, so Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, business book I got a long time ago when I was starting out, just like you. And I had to do a presentation, all of us did on the sales team that I was on. And that was the chapter I got, Begin with the End in Mind. And it's so important and it's really a powerful exercise. And that book is actually still a bestseller on Amazon. And I'm sure a lot of people know it, is to really think about that. That's why backing up to the beginning of a day is beginning with the end in mind. Having some sort of a ritual in place, like I'm really big on this for my clients, is you have to have a non-negotiable morning routine. That's beginning with the end in mind. Because when we can stop and plant all those good things in our head, all those good stories, who do I want to be? What are my intentions? Why am I doing this? Get that bigger why in mind and your bigger intention that usually includes something that's much bigger than yourself. And remind yourself of those things first thing in the morning. Then when the stuff starts hitting the fan, because let's face it, it's gonna, you're prepared. You've built up some stamina. You've already set those intentions for the day before you get to the end of the day. That's just a quick little example of beginning with the end in mind.
I love that. And I know the importance of morning routines. It's definitely a little tricky for me because I'm more of a night person, but I have implemented nighttime routines and it does help. So definitely, like you said, just having that sacred time whenever you can find it to visualize and think about what you want and feel into your body how it feels to have the outcome that you want. So
Mm, that's
in
huge.
yes, and in relation to that, so It does take a little bit of discernment to be able to determine maybe what actually feels good for our soul versus maybe what's just like feeding our ego. For example, maybe I want more presence in my life. That's a soul goal. But maybe my ego wants more money, wants, more freedom from everyday life, things like that. How can we determine what is our ego and our mind story talking versus what actually is true to our soul and the outcome that we might truly want?
Well, I love what you said, soul goal. That's cool. Well, ultimately, I feel like if your why's big enough, I'm going to go back to that intention because it's so important to live with that intention, right? So you said, I want to make more money. Well, you got to keep drilling down. But why? Okay, well, because I want my child to go to this really great school they want to go to. It's really expensive. All right, why do you want them to go there? Because I want to have a really good life. Like, and the more you keep peeling that back, that money goal, although it looks, you could call it ego, is always going to come down to your soul. You mentioned a word that is your soul. You said freedom. And all of our souls just want freedom. We are born for freedom. We don't want to be locked down. We don't want to be caged in, right? So that is a soul. Like if you keep peeling it back, it might seem like an ego goal, but we need material things. We can be as spiritual as we want. We still can't ignore the fact that we need material things in this world. And maybe the goal is, wow, I want to make $1 million because I want to give back to this charity and that one and this one. I want to make the world a better place. I want to help kids who don't have enough food on their plate every day in this country. Whatever your thing is, whatever your intention is, that expands out. And that is a beautiful thing. That is totally feeding your soul and your family dinner, right?
Yeah. So it seems like when we peel back the layers at the end of the day, there is the true intention underneath it that we just have to keep asking to get to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one more question on this. So sometimes when we know where we want to be, but we're not quite there yet, we can have these stories in our minds about our outcome, about how where we are is not good enough. So what strategies do you have for releasing those stories that maybe want us to be somewhere other than where we are right now?
Yeah. Well, I talk about this little mantra. I think it's really important to have mantras for yourself, right? Like that you use throughout the day that makes sense for you. And actually, we could combine this with the next step that's coming up because that whole little story, not good enough, is just one of those. We all have that. It's just one of those deep-seated human stories that we tell. But is that really true, right? You got to reframe that and you got to switch it up. Is that really true? Really? Like, let's take a look at all the things, that I've done in the world that make me feel good. Let's take a look. I have I have my clients put together a folder. It's called a feel good folder. And in that folder is all that stuff. It's a list of all the kick-ass things you did. It's a list of everything. Even getting over something is really an awesome thing that you did, right? So that goes on the list. So you need to have little reminders for yourself when that little sneaky little imposter thing comes up. And usually that happens when we're stressed. So using some of your strategies, getting out of what you're doing, going out and changing your physiology, changing what you're focused on, right? Go make a nice dinner. You're focused on something else for a minute. But really just finding a way to bring yourself back and reframe that story that you're telling yourself. Write it down and ask yourself those questions about it. I actually am good enough. I'm good enough just because I'm here, because I'm human, right? So having whatever that little mantra is that can work for you to help you. I was going to say one of the things you said too is like being here in the moment versus always looking towards the future. And that's, it's a yoga mantra too. It's be where your feet are. Well, hold on a second. I've said it to my kids so many times that now they'll say, Mom, be where your feet are. They say it back to me. It's really awesome. Right when I need to hear it, right? So whatever that little mantra is that works for you, I love asking people when they come on my show what their little personal mantra is, because you got to have something that stops you in your tracks so you can be like, wait a second. I'm really off focus here. That's not really true. Do I really want to say that to myself? How does that make me feel when I tell myself that story? Let's rework that story. Let's rewrite that story. Let's tell a new story about ourselves.
I love the mantra, be where your feet are. It's in your book. And it's great that your kids are reflecting it back to you because it's just a good reminder. It's good to have those external reminders. And you mentioned it too, but the next step is reframe. So can you talk a little bit more about how we can reframe our stories, and does it matter if we don't necessarily believe the reframe right away?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the reframe is just like you would, it's the favorite of most coaches and psychotherapists. They love the reframe. And a lot of times using your friends, if you can't get a certain reframe, will help you get over that you don't believe it thing that you're creating in your own mind. But we all do that, right? So sometimes when we can ask somebody outside of ourselves, if you don't necessarily believe that reframe, like let's say somebody comes to me with their worst story. I love that because I know that we're on the verge of a big breakthrough with somebody's worst story, because inside that I'll be able to see the turnaround and the strength in that story, right? We can't always see that ourselves. That's why friends are really great to bounce things off of. Hey, this worst thing that happened to me. What are your thoughts on it? What do you see there? So asking somebody if you don't necessarily believe it is a really great way to help you believe that reframe, and the more you can look at it objectively, and again, I'm going to bring back to writing and journaling, is just writing it out. Could this be true? Why not? Why couldn't this be true, right? If anything's possible and we live in a world of all possibilities, why couldn't it be true that the opposite of that story is actually true about me? So really working with that, and I give a lot of ways and a lot of examples in the book on how to do that and take those stories and ask other people, ask your friends, ask your family, what are your thoughts on this story? What do you see in this story that I'm missing? And that, again, it comes back to asking yourself really better questions, learning to ask yourself questions that are supportive of you, because your mind is trained and it's built, and all of us are programmed the same to give you an answer to that question. So if you're asking it bad questions like, oh my God, why does this always happen? Oh, why are you so stupid? Right? Whatever that nasty little story is that we have up there that we don't share with anybody, get a hold of that story, because in that story, when you can turn those stories around, you're really going to be onto something quickly.
I love the idea of asking ourselves better questions, which you talk about in your book. And can you give an example of what maybe a helpful question is to ask when we're stuck in these negative story loops?
Sure, absolutely. You could ask yourself something like, I wonder. Questions are really good. I wonder what else is possible here. I wonder what I am not seeing about this situation that could be good. I wonder how I could make a difference and turn this situation around. So you start asking your brain to come up and use creativity. And now it's going into a total different part of your mind, right? It's going into the right side of your brain, which is where our creativity sits. And when you can ask those, I wonder, you're starting to visualize, you're starting to create a different movie in your mind about what else is possible here. What am I missing about this situation? What is good about this that I just can't see right now? What if this was for my highest good? What if all this was happening for my highest good? Right? You can see instantly how that changes everything about that story that you're telling, because you're only looking at one little piece of it.
Definitely. And I had never thought of the fact that our brain is designed to answer the questions that we ask it. So going back to what you said earlier of asking your brain, why is this so hard? It's going to come up with all the list of reasons of everything that's hard about what you're doing, versus if you have more of an open-ended question, your brain can kind of come up with the endless possibilities of whatever you're asking it. So I love that. And I also want to ask you, you talk about the 3 R's of recycling for use with our stories. Can you talk about that and how you apply that to our stories?
It's so funny because there's that kid song by Jack Johnson, Reduce, Reuse, Recycle. And it's an awesome song. And it just so applies to our stories. It's kind of funny, but it's so true, right? Like, oh, what am I supposed to do with this story? Well, okay, I can 3R. I can reduce the amount of times I tell it. Okay, that's a really good way to get myself out of the habit. Maybe I can't break it right away, but I'm going to reduce it, right? Like if you're trying to break some other kind of habit, I'll reduce my carbs until I totally eliminate them, right? Or my sugar. So reducing the amount of times also sort of puts it in the back of your mind, right? And reuse it. How can I reuse this story? It's kind of like rewriting it, right? Wow, I really love this aspect of the story where I did X, Y, and Z. Don't love this aspect of it. How could I reuse it? Well, I could really focus on what was good about that story. I could focus on the skills I attained because I got through that thing, right? So it's sort of like the reframe. You're reusing that story, just like you would reuse something or regift it or whatever. And then some of those stories recycle, they just need to go in the recycle bin, right? They just do. Like that one that I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, right? All those stories that are just innately human stories. They can go in the recyclable bin. You can try to work with them. You can try to take them through those steps. But if you're not getting any progress, just put it in the recycle bin and create a whole new story that works better.
Send it off. Send it back into the abyss.
Send it off. Put it on that little conveyor belt, right? And you can just put it on there, and you don't have to worry about that story anymore, and focus on a different story. Ask a new story. Ask a better question. All right, I'm going to put that story in the recycle bin. What else? What do I want to focus on? What do I really want? What's working in my life? Because it's so easy to find what's not working. That is how we're programmed. All you have to do is pick up your phone for just 5 minutes, and you can feel crappy if you want to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to look for what's not working, which is why my show's called Look for the Good. But you can start to reprogram your brain, and this is how you're doing it. You're reprogramming your brain to start to look for what's working. So it's okay to do 3 are your stories. Let's focus on the stories that I like. Let's focus on the stories that make me feel good. Oh, and when I tell that story, I notice everybody around me. I just lifted the energy up with that story. Because you never want to be that person who stands in a party and the energy's high and everybody's having a great time. And you come in with that story and the whole energy of the room just goes like down to the ground. Like, okay, you don't want to be that, right?
So true. So true. And I can definitely relate to that feeling. And yeah, it's just important to be cognizant of how we're impacting other people. And I think also to just be okay with the fact that it's not going to change overnight. Sometimes you just have to start with one story at a time. And
Totally.
like you said, we've been programmed our whole lives to kind of see the negative, and that's our survival mechanism too. So with enough training, we can see the positive more often than not. So the
Yeah.
last part of the story is you had it all along. So can you expand on that?
You did. Yes. Dorothy. So look, Glinda said to Dorothy, she had the power all along. And I love this because I have my song. Well, I have my songs in there through QR codes in my book.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when I do the Take It Back song, which is, talking, we never say the word power, but it's taking back your power, right? The power that we give away to everybody else, the power that we all the time unknowingly, especially as women, girls, we were brought up to give our power away. Shh, be quiet, sit there, don't say anything. Look beautiful, but don't say anything, right? And keep yourself small. Don't be too smart. All those things, which aren't true. They're just little stories in there, right? And so, learning to polish up our stories and really step into that power and start to determine, hey, that story is giving my power away. I'm going to take that back, and really going through and taking a look at, we are powerful just because we're humans, because we're here on this planet, and we can create anything our minds can conceive of. That's power. But really knowing the difference between what I do have power or control over, which the only thing I really do is myself and my thoughts and my feelings, versus trying to get power over things that we'll never have power over, other people, their decisions, what they do. And when we can make that discernment, you mentioned that great word earlier, between those things, then our anxiety level comes down. Because really all we ever can do is create what we want in our lives and our thoughts and what's going on in here. But we're so pulled to be externally faced, it becomes harder and harder as time goes on. So you have to be strategic. You have to decide that this is how you want to live your life, and then get your plan together with how you're going to do it. That's why I love the 5 steps. It's a simple plan to help you really take your power back. And it starts with catching those stories. It starts inside. It starts with figuring out, what are those stories that were planted in my brain? Because sometimes they're not all negative. We have a lot of those, but we also have some glorious stories of one time a teacher said, wow, you're a really good writer. And that's stuck in your head forever. Or, oh, you're really good at that instrument. Keep doing that. Keep playing that. Or, you're so strong. I admire that in you. Like, whatever those little other stories are, write those down and make sure you keep track of those stories, because those can change your life really, really fast.
Yeah, definitely. There are some good ones in there, and we have so much going on, like you said, in the external world, and we forget sometimes to reflect and go inward. So I'm curious about your experience as you've worked with your own stories. Have you found that as you've gone along, there's just always another story to reframe or recycle, reuse? Or have you found that as time's gone on, the stories have kind of lessened and you've been able to be more present in the moment?
Well, I think there's always stories popping up because that's just the way we're designed. It's how you deal with the stories, right? And then when you can start to say, oh, that's just a story I'm telling myself. It's not necessarily true. You can't believe everything you tell yourself, right? Because once you start to have and you start to get the skills, it's just another skill set. It's just another tool in your back pocket and you have your go-tos. They don't affect you as much. You recognize them quicker. You're like, ooh, that's just a story that I told about that. Let's take a look at that. Is that true? And now you have ways of dealing with it because you always have new stories that come in, right? Because new situations happen, right? So you just have better ways of dealing with them to keep yourself in that PMA, present moment awareness.
Oh, I like that. PMA. That's cute.
Yeah, not to be confused with PMS.
Totally different. You can also be PMA with PMS, but not as fun.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so you get better at handling the stories and recognizing the stories. Then you get so excited you want to help everybody else with their stories when they're not always into that.
That is perfect because it brings me to my next question about this, because oftentimes when we go on this journey of self-awareness, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. So as I've gone on this journey of self-awareness, I've noticed other stories about other people coming up about, maybe I don't think they're on the journey they should be on. And I'm curious about this because as we notice our stories and how they're making us feel and how they make other people feel, we may encounter other people who are telling stories that are creating low vibe within us. So I'm curious how you would suggest to handle someone in your life who is stuck in these lower vibe stories.
That's a good one. That's a good question. There's so many of those because you want to dive in. You want to dive in and be like, that's just the story you're telling yourself. But that never goes over well. So
Mm.
this is where you have a little bit of the detachment theory, right? Where that is their process. That's their path. Okay, if it's my child, that's a different story. I'll open it up for discussion, or a close friend who is open to hearing some feedback. But, if I can't, start telling, other people in my family or that I know, or they should change their story. That's where you got to bite your tongue a little bit. But, and here's the cool thing about this work, right? You're never going to be able to go back to where you weren't aware of your story. So it's really cool that you're recognizing that in other people. It becomes really good fodder for creativity, right? I like to think of it like I'm always kind of listening into life because I'm a songwriter, right? So everything's always a little gem of a song starting or a story or a book or whatever. So it becomes that where you can kind of be a little bit detached from it. And it doesn't have to be an argument because you realize that's something they need to work out in and of themselves. It actually gives you more tools to stay in your own good place and just know what's going on, without being reactive to it or having it become a trigger for you. Besides, you can think of it, triggers are actually really a great thing that happen because they tell us more about ourselves. Ooh, I guess I need to work on that area a little bit more, right? So
Mm.
you're always using it as a tool, as food to feed that insatiable appetite that our soul has to get better at this thing called life. Get better at managing the only thing we ever have any control to manage, which is ourselves and our reactions to things.
Yep, that's so true. We don't have control over anybody else. We can only control ourselves and our own stories. So,
Yeah.
what about those stories that maybe are older and stronger? So, maybe it's you have stories with certain relationships like family, let's say. Family is a
Hmm.
really touchy one.
Yes.
And you can't necessarily remove yourself from your family. So, do you
That's
think
true.
Do you think it's all kind of an internal work, or do you think there comes a point where you maybe need to have a conversation or have some separation?
Well, I think it's harder with family, because those are such trigger stories for us too. I mean, I grew up in a family with 5 kids, and if we all experience it, we're part of a situation, and you ask every one of us their perspective on that, you're going to get 5 different answers every single time. My one sister used to have these crazy perspectives, and I'm there in the same room, and I'm like, wait a second, what? But you never got anywhere bringing that up, because people see life not as it is, right? I
Mhm.
say this in the very beginning of my book. They see it as they are. So she's looking at that through her lens, which is very different than my lens. I have a very different lens. So I see it differently. I interpret it differently. And so that's why it's not even worth arguing. That's their perspective. You're not going to be able to change it. If you want to have a discussion about it, that's fine. But you're gaining so much perspective about not only yourself when you do this work, but everybody around you. And it allows you to have more compassion for people who are stuck in those stories, is what it really does. Because you recognize it and you know it sucks to be there. But unless they want to, you can't change them, and you can't change their stories either. But you can change your story about them. That's all you really can do. But that will help you a lot to change your story. Wow, I can see that they're really stuck in their stories. I pray for them that they can get out of that someday. I send them good vibes that, someday they'll be able to not be so reactionary to other people's, and it can help you to assuage that anxiety that comes up in you, because that's all you really can do, you know? I mean, you can throw them a copy of my book, but really,
They would love it. They change their stories immediately, I know it.
yeah, when it doesn't come from you, right?
Yeah, somebody else has to tell them,
Yeah, and I
so.
have to be careful, right? People don't always want to hear what I can't coach my friends, right? Like
Mhm.
you just have to be respectful and have compassion when other people are at a different place with, telling a new story than you are.
Yeah. Yeah, compassion is definitely key for yourself too, for maybe having stories about somebody else not being where you think they should be, and for the other person for having their own stories and living those out.
Totally.
I wanted to ask you about your book too. So in the book, you put together meditations and you put music in there. And I don't know if there was a greater purpose for putting them in the book, or it was just fun, but I loved it. It made the reading the book so interactive. And I just wanted to ask you about that. What inspired you to include the meditations and the music in the book?
Well, I always knew that I was going to write a book with my music in it. I just didn't know how, and as musicians, we always knew what QR codes were, because years ago we used to put them on our posters to tell people where the shows were. So we knew what they were, but most people didn't. I thought I was going to use a Spotify code, but then QR codes, look at it now. Everybody knows what a QR code is. But when I
Mhm.
launched my book in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, people didn't really know. But I always knew that that was my connection, that I was going to have my music, because my music is really just a song is a 3-minute story. So I would always tell those, but it was always the stories between the songs. People would always come up to me afterwards, be like, wow, that story you really told, that really moved me. And then that song and the whole thing. So it's a whole package. But I never thought, I mean, it was hard. I'm not going to, I'm not going to lie. It's hard sometimes to tell those stories between the stories, because all the stuff that happened in my family and such. And they weren't stories I talked about a lot. But really to be able to get the story behind the story, and then have that powerful piece of the music. And the meditation, of course, is to help people really. I loved creating those. Those were so fun. To really integrate the learning, really take it into the body on a somatic level and really feel it, and help people come up with their own practice, right? Ways to do what I'm saying, to get in that present moment awareness, to take a look at your life objectively, to get in there and realize what those stories are, and to give you that space inside, right? Like meditation creates that space so that you have space inside you when, as we say, you can practice off the mat, right?
Mm.
And then you get to carry that with you all day long. And that's the space between what happens, and you get to choose how you respond instead of our knee-jerk reactions, which are so programmed into us from an early age. So if you're interested in being able to have that space and make those changes in the moment, that's where it comes from.
I loved it. I thought it was so creative because I read a lot, and sometimes I'm kind of just reading to finish the book. It's not necessarily integrating. I loved that it just felt so interactive at the end of a chapter. I would listen to a song or I would play the meditation, and it helped the book feel more like an experience,
Mm.
not just something I was going to finish and put away. And I told you this already, but if you ever create an app for the meditations, let me know because they were amazing.
Thank you so much. And, that whole experiential thing that you're talking about, I mean, I say it's interactive, but people don't really get it until they have the book in front of them. It becomes so interactive. I'm interacting with people's emotions with the music and the song, and they can learn, they can see through my stories and how I change mine. And then they go, wow, I can change my stories, and then all the exercises in there that keep you invested in finding those stories and what are those stories. Yeah, I loved creating it. So thank you so much for saying that. I really love that you appreciated that.
Yeah, of course. It was really, really well done. I want to end. I know you talked about it in your book, some of your personal stories. If you don't want to share, that's totally fine. But I wanted to see if you could talk about the significance of the quote, "You could get hit by a bus tomorrow," and why it's important to live in that way.
Wow. Well, that was something a lot of the stuff in the book, like that was something my dad used to say all the time. That was his story. And it's so powerful because as a kid, I didn't really get like, why does dad say that all the time? But he was trying to say, you only get this one life. You have one life to live. You don't know what's going to happen to you tomorrow. And as you grow in this world, you realize how true that really is, and you're not promised, nobody is promised tomorrow. So making the most of today and living with intention and, like you said, feeding your soul is really what we're here for. We're really here to find joy. And when you give yourself space to find it, it's always there. When you're creating that space intentionally in your life, whether it's through meditation or whatever, maybe you have a dirt church outside and you like going hiking or right, well, like all those things together, whatever it is for you, when you're creating space intentionally, and you don't forget about the things that make you joyful in life. That's the other thing my dad used to say is when you have gifts, when God gives you gifts, whatever they are, it's your responsibility to share those, to put them out to the world, no matter what your gifts are. And so I think embracing that and remembering that, I'm going to say another quote now, Wayne Dyer, don't die with your music still in you. What is that thing? What is that thing that you've longed to do that only you can do in your particular way? That's what makes us all so beautifully human. Is we think that everybody else has that skill or that ability to do fill in the blank, but nobody can do it quite like you. And sharing that with the world will give you joy and joy to everybody else in the world.
So true and so wise. And you never know how something you do or say is going to resonate with somebody else. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank
Thank you.
you for all of the wisdom that you've brought to the episode today and in your book. I love that there's tangible steps. It's broken down. There's journaling, meditation, music, anything you could want. So thank you so much for that. And for listeners that are resonating and they want to connect with you and get your book, where is the best place for them to go?
Tell them to come to my website, carrierowan.com, CarrieRowan.com. We always like to spell on the radio and podcast.
It's easier.
Thank you so much for having me on. This has been a really amazing conversation, Megan.
Thank you. As always, I will link Carrie's website down below. And my offering to you this week is to just try to identify one story that you might be telling yourself or others that's no longer serving you. Maybe you try rewriting this story with a friend, a family member, a partner, or maybe you just use a journal to get a more objective lens on the story and how you can potentially rewrite it. And I would invite you to take it one step further, where you maybe tell the same story that you've been telling with a different intention and see how it lands with yourself or with other people. And of course, if you're interested in Carrie's book, I would highly recommend it. It really does just give you the opportunity to integrate everything that she talks about in the book and in the episode today. So definitely check it out if you're interested. As always, thank you for listening and much love to you all.